You're walking through a dense forest somewhere in prehistoric Europe. You've been traveling for 3 days. Your group is tired, your water supply is running low, and through the trees ahead, you can see the unmistakable shimmer of a valley. Green, wide open, threaded with a river that catches the light like something out of a dream. There's game down there. There's water. There's everything you need to survive the next week. And every single person in your group stops walking. Not because they saw a predator, not because the terrain is impassable. There's no physical barrier, no cliff edge, no raging flood. The valley is right there, completely accessible, and nobody moves toward it. The oldest member of the group says something. The others nod, and you turn around and walk the long way, adding 2 days to your journey, burning calories you can't afford to waste, to go around a place that looked, from the outside, perfectly fine. This happened. Not once, not in one location. Archaeologists have identified specific valleys, passes, and lowland corridors across Europe, Africa, and Central Asia, where early human presence simply drops to zero for stretches of thousands of years. Not because people weren't in the region. The evidence of camps, tools, and fire pits surrounds these places on all sides. People were living right up to the edges. They just weren't going in. For a long time, the easy explanation was superstition, primitive fear, the idea that early humans were scared of things they didn't understand and invented taboos to manage that fear. Which is partially true, but it completely misses the point. Because here's the thing about prehistoric taboos. They weren't random. They didn't spring from nothing. In a world without hospitals, without antibiotics, without any safety net whatsoever, the groups that survived were the ones that learned fast and passed that knowledge down with absolute seriousness. A taboo that persisted for 10,000 years wasn't superstition. It was compressed data. It was the distilled record of every person who went into that valley and didn't come back, encoded into cultural memory so deep it looked like instinct. The real question isn't why ancient humans avoided these places. The real question is what was actually in them. And the answer, once you start pulling at the thread, is genuinely one of the stranger things you'll learn about the planet you've been living on your entire life. Because some of these valleys were killing people. Quietly, invisibly, in ways that left no obvious trace. And the only warning system early humans had was each other. There's a place in Cameroon called Lake Nyos. On the night of August 21st, 1986, something happened there that killed 1,700 people and 3,500 livestock in a matter of hours. No explosion, no earthquake, no visible disaster of any kind. People simply stopped breathing in their sleep across an entire region. Animals dropped in the fields. Birds fell out of the sky. The valley around the lake went silent in a way that took days for the outside world to even notice. The cause was a geological event called a limnic eruption. The lake, sitting over a volcanic pocket deep in the earth, had been silently accumulating massive concentrations of carbon dioxide in its lower layers for years. That night, something triggered a sudden release. An invisible cloud of CO2, heavier than air, rolled down the valley at ground level like a slow tide, displacing every molecule of oxygen in its path. If you were asleep in its path, you never woke up. If you were awake, you had maybe 30 seconds before your legs stopped working. Now here's the part that changes everything. Lake Nyos didn't create this problem in 1986. The geology that makes it capable of doing that has been in place for thousands of years. Researchers studying the sediment layers at the bottom of similar crater lakes across Central Africa and the East African Rift have found evidence of periodic mass die-off events going back tens of thousands of years. The lake has done this before, probably many times. And every time, the valley around it became a graveyard with no visible cause of death. Archaeologists working in the broader Lake Nyos region have noted something consistent with patterns found elsewhere across the African Rift and parts of Central Europe. Human habitation evidence clusters around the elevated terrain surrounding these volcanic lake systems, not in the valleys themselves. The valley floors, despite offering water, flat land, and shelter from wind, show dramatically lower concentrations of human activity across multiple prehistoric periods. The absence is too systematic to be coincidental, and CO2 is only one piece of it. Researchers studying avoided zones in Iceland, the Rift Valley, and parts of the Carpathian Basin have cataloged at least 3 additional mechanisms that could produce the same result. Places that felt wrong, made people sick, caused disorientation and panic, and killed the unlucky ones without leaving a single mark on the body. Volcanic hydrogen sulfide seeping through soil. Infrasound from geological fault activity, operating below the threshold of human hearing, but triggering profound, unshakable feelings of dread. Natural pathogen reservoirs in stagnant lowland water systems that decimated any group that camped near them long enough. Early humans didn't have the vocabulary for any of this. They didn't need it. They had something more reliable. They had the count of who went in and who came back. Here's what makes this genuinely uncomfortable to think about. The mechanisms we just described, the gas pockets, the infrasound, the invisible biological hazards, none announce themselves. There's no smell you can reliably detect, no sound you can consciously hear, no visible threat to point at and name. You just start feeling wrong. Your heart rate climbs for no reason. Your legs get heavy. You feel watched or panicked or suddenly certain that you need to leave immediately without being able to explain why to anyone standing next to you. And then, if you stay long enough, you don't leave at all. For early humans, that experience would have had no rational framework, but it would have had consequences. And consequences in a pre-literate world were the entire curriculum. Researchers studying indigenous oral traditions across multiple continents have identified a pattern that's hard to dismiss once you see it. Warnings about specific geographic locations, particular valleys, lake basins, mountain passes, that have been maintained across hundreds of generations with remarkable geographic precision. The Aboriginal Australians have oral traditions describing specific dangerous landscapes that, when mapped against modern geological surveys, align with actual hazard zones, areas of volcanic activity, natural gas seepage, unstable terrain. Some of these traditions are estimated to be over 10,000 years old. They survived the entire span of recorded human history, passed mouth to ear, generation to generation, without a single word written down. That is not mythology. That is a library. The cognitive scientists who study this call it cultural memory transmission, and the more they examine it, the more they conclude that pre-literate societies were far more sophisticated in how they encoded and preserved critical survival information than we have ever given them credit for. A story about a valley where the spirits eat your breath isn't primitive superstition dressed up in narrative. It's a precise geographic warning about CO2 displacement, translated into the only format that a non-literate culture could guarantee would survive contact with the next 50 generations. You can lose a clay tablet. You cannot lose a story that every child in the group learns before they learn anything else. And here's the detail that pulls it all together. When archaeologists map the edges of these avoided zones and look at where human settlements clustered instead, they don't find random distribution. They find evidence of deliberate elevated positioning. Campsites on ridgelines overlooking valleys rather than inside them. Fire pits on the upwind side of lake basins. Burial sites placed at distances from valley floors that, in retrospect, correspond almost exactly to the furthest reach of documented gas dispersion events in those same locations. These people didn't know the chemistry. They didn't need to. Over thousands of years of accumulated loss, they had reverse engineered the safe perimeter through trial and catastrophic error, encoded it into every story they told their children, and moved their entire lives to stay just outside the line that the dead had drawn for them. So what happened to all those warnings? Some of them held. There are valleys in Iceland that local communities have informally avoided for centuries. Modern geological surveys have since confirmed persistent volcanic gas seepage at ground level. There are lake basins in East Africa where indigenous populations maintained elevated settlements for thousands of years. They only descended into the valley floors after colonial-era resettlement programs moved them there by force. Within decades, those communities were experiencing health problems. Epidemiologists are still working to fully explain them. But mostly, the warnings didn't hold. Somewhere in the last few thousand years, a critical transition happened. We stopped being a species that accumulated caution. We started being a species that accumulated confidence. The difference between those two things is not always obvious until it's too late. The Roman Empire built cities in geologically active zones across the Mediterranean. Romans were engineers, and engineers solve problems. They didn't avoid the valley, they drained it. They didn't respect the gas seep, they paved over it. Sometimes that worked brilliantly. Sometimes you get Pompeii. The Industrial Revolution accelerated this process by several orders of magnitude. We filled in the lowlands, we built in the floodplains, we converted every avoided valley into real estate, farmland, or a scenic overlook with a parking lot. We had modern science. Modern science told us we understood what we were dealing with, except we didn't always, and we still don't always. There are currently populated areas sitting above the same categories of geological hazard that emptied those prehistoric valleys. Crater Lake regions in Central Africa, low-lying basins in volcanic zones across Italy, Japan, and the American Northwest. Communities built in natural acoustic corridors, where infrasound from fault activity has been linked in preliminary research to elevated rates of anxiety disorders, sleep disruption, and what residents describe as a persistent, sourceless feeling that something is wrong. Nobody is leaving. The parking lots are full. The schools are rated well. Here's what ancient humans understood that we have largely forgotten. The absence of an explanation for why a place feels dangerous is not the same as the absence of danger. For most of human history, that distinction was kept alive through story, through ritual, through the specific and serious business of remembering what the dead had learned. The valley looked fine from the outside. It always looks fine from the outside. That was never the point. The point was that someone went in. The people who loved them never stopped pointing at the tree line and saying, quietly, to every generation that came after, "Not there. We don't go there." We stopped listening. We built a coffee shop there instead. Most of the time, nothing happens. But the geology hasn't changed. The gas is still in the rock. The fault is still moving at the same rate it always moved. The lake is still accumulating pressure in its lowest layer, the same way it was accumulating pressure the night before August 21st, 1986. Your ancestors weren't afraid of the dark. They were afraid of the specific dark that had already killed someone they knew. That's not fear, that's information, and we threw most of it away.